What's up, everybody? Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different on this channel. This is potentially the start of a new series called Fix Your Franchise, where I go through each of the non-playoff teams for the 2024-25 season and look at their roster for next year and kind of go through what a good offseason plan would be for each of those teams. And we're going to start with the team at the bottom of the standings right now, the Chicago Blackhawks. I just did a video on Connor Bedard a little while ago and how he has not quite reached his expectations. So I think this is a very good team to do first in the series because this is a very crucial offseason for the Blackhawks. And we're going to go beyond just looking at the roster. We're going to look at this from an organizational top-down perspective, what the team should be doing this offseason and whether the people who are currently in charge or we think will be in charge next year are the best people to lead them forward. So let's look at the Blackhawks from a holistic sense of where they are. They have Connor Bedard coming up on the last year of his entry-level contract. After next year, he's going to need to sign an extension, and based on where he was drafted and expectations around him, regardless of production, it's probably going to be a big one. They already have one of the younger rosters in the NHL, and they're probably going to move on from a lot of veterans this offseason, guys like Pat Maroon, Alec Martinez. So they're going to be getting even younger next season. I'm sure a lot of Blackhawks fans would say that's fine. We're in the middle of a rebuild. We just need to keep loading up on draft picks, moving off of the assets that we can get rid of. But I actually have a different perspective. I think that this offseason, as we're coming up on the end of Bedard's rookie deal, is the year that you need to start being more aggressive in improving your team. I think this is the offseason that the Blackhawks should be taking some big swings, going out and getting some good players to surround Bedard, kind of prop him up. As I mentioned in that video about him, I think that he and some of the younger players are developing some bad habits, and that so much losing has kind of, I don't want to say infected their mentality, but it's had a negative impact. I think there's a risk that a team like the Blackhawks could get a little bit too stuck in losing and just not be able to pull themselves out of that. So I think this is an offseason that management and ownership needs to signal to the players, to the fans, that we are stunned with the losing. We have the good young players that we've drafted. We've accumulated a lot of top 5 draft picks. We're probably going to have another one in this upcoming draft. We've used 8 first-round draft picks in the last 3 years. We're betting that at least half of those guys are going to be very productive NHL players. So we're not pushing more chips into the future. We're going to start loading up on good players now to help those young players that we drafted. So I get better. And so going through the offseason plan, let's look at this team from the top down and start at the very, very top with GM Kyle Davidson. Now, Davidson took over the team as interim general manager in 2021 and was then promoted to full-time general manager. And in the parts of 4 years that Davidson has been the general manager, the Blackhawks have a record of 94, 175, and 32. They've had 40 losses in each of his seasons as GM, and those loss totals have climbed every single year. Now, for this year, it does look like things are getting better and on the upswing, but they are still slated to finish at the bottom of their division and miss the playoffs for the 4th straight time in Davidson's reign. Now, I won't hold him to just his win and loss record because he did take over and initiate a rebuild. And like I mentioned, the Blackhawks have used 8 first-round picks in the last 3 years alone. And when you look at how that draft record has turned out, obviously he had Bedard. That was a pick that anybody would have made. But the Blackhawks do, according to the Hockey Writers, have the #1 prospect pool in the entire NHL. They have a tier 1 prospect, a top 10 prospect in Artyom Levshunov, their first-round pick from last year. They have a couple of tier 3 prospects in Frank Nazar and Oliver Moore. And then finally, 3 tier 4 prospects who are in the top 100, Sam Rinzel, Roman Kantsarov, and Sasha Boyber. So that strategy of rebuilding has reaped some good rewards. And he did make some good trades in pursuit of that rebuild, trading away Kirby Dach and Alex DeBrincat for first-round picks, got a couple for Brandon Hagel. But then again, he also allowed Dylan Strome to walk for free, and he has developed into one of the best centers in the NHL. DeBrincat has been great as a Red Wing, even though he didn't work out with the Senators. So in general, I think it's fair to say that Davidson has been a mixed bag in terms of his transactions. I'm not willing to say that they should absolutely fire him this offseason, but if I was Blackhawks ownership and fans, I would be saying that this is an offseason where things need to start turning around and they need to be at least competitive. Seeing some of those tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 prospects starting to come into the NHL and the team taking a major step forward. Now going on to the head coach, obviously they fired Luke Richardson earlier in the year and Anders Sorensen took over for him. He has not done spectacularly as a coach since, though I wouldn't expect the Blackhawks to be too secondary to him going into next season. If I was them, I would be kicking the tires on David Carl, the coach out of the University of Denver. He has been one of the hottest coaching prospects in the last cycle of the NHL coaching carousel. He did say last year that he was committed to staying at Denver, but you're the Blackhawks, you have Connor Bedard. That's a very enticing situation for a young, promising coaching prospect that could really energize your team and your fan base. If you can't get him, if he decides to stay in Denver, there are some good experienced coaches out there. Gerard Gallant is a guy who immediately pops to the top of mind, a really good coach in my opinion. Jay Woodcroft is available, former Oilers coach. He knows something about working with generational players, and I think he kind of got a raw deal in Edmonton last year, just suffering from terrible goaltending. And then there are other options who could shake free this offseason. Mike Sullivan would be a guy to watch for out of Pittsburgh, but in my opinion, there are just much better options for the Blackhawks to go for than running it back with Anders Sorensen next year. So that's what I would do for the front office and behind the bench. Now let's move on to the roster itself, and right here we can see what the Blackhawks roster looks like as of March 15th, 2025. You can also see at the bottom we have some players who are on IR right now, and also players that are the top prospects in the organization who I would expect could have a shot at making the lineup next year. So I went through and I looked at the last 10 Stanley Cup champions, and I tried to break down the key elements that they have that made them successful, and I came up with 8 players that almost every Stanley Cup team had on their roster. Those being a number 1 center, a number 1 winger, number 1 defenseman, a number 1 goalie, or a number 1 A1B goalie tandem, a number 2 center, a top 6 winger, and 2 top 4 defensemen. Every single Stanley Cup champion had at least 6 of those, and most had at least 7 or 8. So looking at the Blackhawks roster right now, what do they have? And unfortunately, the answer is not much. In my opinion, Connor Bedard is not right now a number 1 center for a team that can compete for a Stanley Cup. They don't have any forwards who I would say are even top 6 players on a very competitive team. On defense, I think that there are a couple of guys who would be considered top 4 defensemen, Alex Vlasic and Connor Murphy. And then after that, I would say that they have a 1A, 1B goaltender in Arvin Soderblom. And then I would say that they acquired one at the deadline in Spencer Knight. In my opinion, this offseason is critical, like I said, for the Blackhawks to be competitive. And I would be trying to get to maybe 4 or 5 of these key positions locked up in this offseason. And the good news is that you don't have to go outside of the organization really to do that. Like I said, you already have Alex Vlasic, but I also think that with some development, Connor Bedard is going to become a number 1 center in the NHL. And I also think with the right players around them, Frank Nazar and Ryan Donato could become top 6 players, either on the wing or at center. Teuvo Teravainen has proven in the past that he can be a top 6 winger, but he has not played up to that level this year, in part because of the teammates around him. So again, if you augment that top 6 a little bit with somebody from outside of the organization, I think that that helps 3 or 4 players that you already have on the roster. So who should the Blackhawks go after? The obvious answer is a guy who's going to be a free agent this offseason, is going to get paid huge money, Mitch Marner. Marner is going to demand a hefty contract, and the Blackhawks are one of the teams that can afford to pay it right now. Next year, they're projected to have over $37 million in salary cap space. That's one of the highest in the NHL, and they only have a few RFAs that they'll be looking to re-sign, guys like Kershaw and Louis Crevier. The other guys who are going to be UFAs are older, like Alec Martinez, Pat Maroon. I don't know if you're bringing back any of those guys, and if you are, it's going to be on the super cheap. So they're going to have room to add a guy like Mitch Marner if they want to. And for what it's worth, I think that Mitch Marner would be a perfect fit in the Blackhawks organization. He would be penciled in as the number 2 center, or potentially a number 1 winger to go along with Bedard. I think that's where he's most comfortable, being sort of the Robin to a Batman, like he is right now in Toronto, was the second fiddle to Nylander and Matthews. And I do worry that if he goes somewhere where he has to be the guy, the number 1 guy in an organization, that might be too much pressure for him. I think going to Chicago, where it's clearly Bedard's team, would be a perfect fit for Marner. If they don't land Mitch Marner, another guy who I think that they could go after is Jeff Skinner. Obviously coming off of a down year in Edmonton, which is very surprising, but he's a 40 goal scorer, a guy who has proven he can be a number 1 winger in even a bad organization like the Buffalo Sabres. I think he would be a good one to pair with Bedard and see if that can energize both of them. Another guy who is older that you could look for, also coming from the Toronto Maple Leafs, is John Tavares. He's going to be a free agent. He's still 34, so he's got a couple of good years left in him, and he would be, again, like Marner, an ideal number 2 center / top line wing for the young Bedard. The bottom bottom six, though, I do have them mainly going young, bringing up guys like Oliver Moore, Sasha Boyver, maybe a guy like Colton Dock, who's played in a few NHL games this year, and potentially you could add one or two veterans to the bottom six if you wanted, but I would really use that space to give some of the younger guys more of an opportunity to play and see if any of them develop. Now, on the back end, don't have them bringing back Alec Martinez, which means that they are going to have two spots on the top pairing that they need to address. And the one that I would go for is probably going to sound ridiculous, but let me cook here. The Blackhawks should make a trade for Erik Karlsson, the defenseman out of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Dude is still an incredible defenseman when he's healthy, which he has been for the last 2 years in Pittsburgh. Like Tavares, he's 34, so he has some good years left in him. The only concern would be about the contract. He's not worth the $11.5 million cap hit, but he only has 2 years left on it, so I think you're in a position where you could get the Penguins to eat some of that money. And if you could get him for $7 million for a couple of years, I think that that's a gamble worth taking. If not him, there's a couple of guys in free agency I think you could throw some money at. Ivan Provorov and Dmitry Orlov are both very good defensemen. I would say that they're more number twos than number ones, but I think you can make the case that both of them could fit that role. And then as far as the other top pairing defensemen, you have some options like Jeff Petrie, Vlad Gavrikov, Neil Pionk, Ian Cole. None of these guys are necessarily going to be locked into being the number two guy. You could move Alex Vlasic, or see if one of the young guys like Korchinski, Levchinov, or Rinzel develops. But any one of those guys that I mentioned could be a solid guy to put in your top four. And then as far as goaltending goes, I think the Blackhawks are cool to just run it back with Knight and Soderblom. They're both young goaltenders who have a lot of potential. One of them could develop into a number one guy, but if you need to do a tandem with them, I think that would work out just fine. You could get by with those two as your 1 and 2 goaltenders. So that's it. That's my plan for the offseason with the Chicago Blackhawks. I don't necessarily know that this makes them a Stanley Cup contender overnight, and I don't think they have to make every single move that I laid out, but I think if they do enough of them, the Blackhawks will be a competitive team next year, definitely better than they were this year.